Some dogs fail because they are stubborn. Others fail because part of them never came back. Snow drifted sideways across the training yard behind NPD K9, the Northern Provincial Detection Unit responsible for cold weather police tracking outside Edmonton, Alberta. The storm had rolled in before dawn, wrapping the chain-link fences and floodlights in a pale curtain of ice and wind. Every breath turned white the moment it left a mouth. Boots scraped against frozen gravel. Radios crackled softly through layers of winter jackets. And in the middle of the obstacle course, under the dull glow of sodium lights, stood a Doberman named Vargo. He did not move. Track command, the instructor barked again. The black and tan Doberman stared ahead as if the world had gone silent around him. Snow clung to the sleek ridge of his back. His cropped ears twitched once, barely noticeable beneath the frost collecting along their edges. Move. Another command. Another whistle from the standard handlers. Nothing. A young officer near the gate laughed under his breath and shook his head. That dog's cooked, he muttered. 6 months in training and he still freezes like a statue. A few others smirked. Nobody defended the dog anymore. Not after the failures. Not after the incident during the indoor detection exam last November when Vargo had stopped mid-search and simply sat staring at an empty hallway for nearly 4 full minutes while the other dogs completed their drills. Since then, rumors spread through the unit like cold air through broken windows. Some said the Doberman had neurological damage. Others claimed he had once belonged to a federal tactical division before something went wrong up north near Fort Chipewyan. Nobody knew the truth. Not really. They only knew the reports kept arriving with black sections redacted in thick digital ink. Vargo's handler, Officer Dean Wallace, exhaled heavily into his scarf and tugged the leash once. "Come on, buddy," he whispered quietly, more tired than angry now. "Just one clean run." The Doberman lowered his head slightly, amber eyes fixed somewhere beyond the snow-covered barricades. His breathing slowed. The storm hissed through the steel fencing around the yard. Then came another burst of laughter from the rookie officers watching beneath the awning. "Maybe he's scared of snow," someone joked. Dean ignored them, though embarrassment reddened the skin around his eyes. 20 meters away, Commander Elise Morin stood with her clipboard tucked beneath one arm, lips pressed into a thin line. She was a tall woman in her early 50s with silver beginning to creep into her dark hair. The kind of officer who rarely repeated herself. "One more failed assessment," she said calmly, "and the board will recommend removal from active K9 certification." Nobody spoke after that. Even the wind seemed quieter. Vargo remained still in the center of the course while snow gathered softly around his paws. Then, somewhere beyond the gates near the outer parking lot, a sound drifted through the storm. A whistle. Thin. Brief. Almost swallowed by the wind. Vargo's ears snapped upward instantly. The change was so sudden that Dean stepped back in surprise. The Doberman turned his head toward the far end of the compound, muscles tightening beneath his coat for the first time all morning. Every officer in the yard went silent. Beyond the fencing, partly obscured by blowing snow and the dim orange glow of the parking lamps, stood a lone figure beside an older gray RC truck dusted with ice. A man in a dark winter coat. Broad shoulders. One hand buried in his pocket. The other lowering slowly from his mouth after the whistle. Nobody recognized him at first. But Vargo did. The Doberman took one slow step forward. Then another. Not toward the obstacle. Toward the stranger. The snow kept falling long after the training yard went quiet. Tiny crystals drifted beneath the floodlights like ash suspended in slow motion, coating the parked cruisers and the frozen chain-link fences in pale silver. Nobody moved for several seconds after the whistle. Officer Dean Wallace loosened his grip on the leash without realizing it. Commander Elise Morin narrowed her eyes toward the parking lot, trying to make out the stranger through the storm. But Vargo already knew. The Doberman's body had changed completely. The stiffness was gone. His breathing deepened, controlled and focused now, amber eyes locked on the figure beyond the gate as if the rest of the world no longer existed. "Who the hell is that?" one rookie whispered beneath the awning. No one answered. The man near the truck finally stepped forward into the orange wash of the security lights. Mid-40s maybe. Tall. White. A dark wool coat dusted with snow. A faded knit cap pulled low over short brown hair streaked lightly with gray near the temples. He carried himself carefully, favoring his left leg with a slight limp that only became obvious once he reached the gate. There was nothing dramatic about him. No rush. No authority in his posture. Just exhaustion worn quietly over years. Vargo let out a sound then. Not a bark. Not a growl. Something softer. A low vibration deep in his chest that seemed almost uncertain. Dean stared in disbelief. "That's the most noise he's made all week," he muttered. The stranger pushed open the side gate slowly, boots crunching across the frozen gravel. Vargo walked forward immediately, leash dragging loose behind him. Every officer in the yard tensed, waiting for the Doberman to snap the way he had during previous evaluations. Instead, the dog stopped less than a meter away from the man and simply stared upward. Snow melted slowly across the Doberman's muzzle. The man looked down at him with tired blue-gray eyes. Eyes that carried the hollow stillness of someone who had spent too many nights awake. For a moment neither of them moved. Then the stranger spoke quietly. "You're getting old, buddy." Vargo lowered his head. The sound that escaped him this time almost resembled a sigh. Dean blinked hard. "Impossible," he whispered. Commander Morin stepped closer. "Officer," she called carefully, "this is a restricted K9 facility. Identification, please." The man reached slowly into his coat pocket and handed her a weathered card encased in cracked plastic. Morin examined it beneath the yard lights. Her expression shifted almost immediately. "Ethan Mercer," she read quietly. A few of the older officers exchanged looks at the name. One of them straightened beneath his winter jacket. Another looked away altogether. Even the rookies sensed something change in the air. Ethan Mercer. Former Tactical Response Officer for BCU, the Boreal Crisis Unit responsible for remote emergency operations across northern Alberta and Saskatchewan. The division had been quietly dissolved nearly 4 years earlier after an operation near the Athabasca Basin went wrong during a winter extraction. Official details never surfaced publicly. Only rumors did. Rumors about a missing team. About a radio signal that disappeared during a blizzard. About a dog found alive beside wreckage almost 2 days later. Ethan tucked his hands back into his coat pockets. "I heard they transferred him here," he said softly without taking his eyes off Vargo. "Didn't think he'd still remember me." Commander Morin studied him carefully. "You knew this dog?" Ethan hesitated. Snow hissed gently against the floodlights overhead. "Not exactly," he answered at last. "But he remembers a sound." Vargo stepped closer until his shoulder touched Ethan's leg. The Doberman closed his eyes briefly, leaning against the man with a trust none of them had seen before. One of the rookies swallowed hard. "That dog hates everybody," he whispered. Ethan gave the faintest smile, though sadness lingered behind it like old winter smoke. Then somewhere beyond the distant pine trees lining the highway, a freight train horn echoed low through the storm, and for the first time in months, Vargo lifted his head toward the sound instead of shrinking from it. By the time the storm eased near midnight, most of the officers had gone inside, leaving only boot prints frozen into the snow around the training yard. The floodlights buzzed softly overhead, casting pale halos across the ice-covered fencing and silent patrol vehicles lined against the far wall. Vargo remained beside Ethan Mercer near the outer gate as if afraid the man might disappear if he looked away for even a second. The Doberman no longer seemed like the disconnected animal the unit had spent months trying to correct. His posture had changed completely. Calm now. Alert. Focused. Dean Wallace watched from beneath the awning outside the equipment shed, holding a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold in his hands. "I do not understand it," he admitted quietly to Commander Elise Morin. "He barely responds to me half the time." But with that man, Morin kept her eyes on Ethan. "Dogs do not fake trust," she said softly. Inside the administration building, the windows glowed warm against the darkness while snow slid slowly from the roof edges in soft clumps. Ethan finally accepted Morin's invitation to come indoors after nearly 20 minutes standing in the cold with Vargo pressed close to his leg. The moment the Doberman entered the hallway, several younger officers instinctively stepped aside. Not because they feared aggression anymore. Because something about the dog felt different now. Almost human in his attention. The old heating system rattled overhead while wet boots tracked slush across the tiled floor. Somewhere deeper inside the building, a kettle whistled faintly from the staff kitchen. Vargo followed Ethan without a leash. Not once drifting more than half a meter away. One of the rookies noticed it immediately. "He has never healed that naturally before," he whispered. They gathered in the small briefing room near the back offices while wind brushed softly against the frosted windows. Commander Morin set Ethan's identification card on the table between them. "You disappeared 4 years ago," she said carefully. Ethan leaned back slightly in the metal chair, shoulders stiff beneath his coat. "I retired." "That is not what the report said." A faint shadow crossed Ethan's face then. Not anger. Something heavier. Tiredness maybe. Grief that had settled too deep to leave anymore. Vargo lowered himself onto the floor beside him, though his eyes never left Ethan's hands. "Reports say many things," Ethan answered quietly. Silence settled across the room. Dean shifted awkwardly before speaking. "Did you train him?" Ethan looked down at the Doberman for several seconds before answering. "No," he said. "I was never his handler." That surprised everyone. Dean frowned. "Then why does he respond to you?" Ethan rubbed slowly at the scar along his left wrist, hidden partly beneath his sleeve. "Because I was there the last night he trusted somebody." Outside, snowplows groaned faintly along the distant highway beyond the compound. The sound seemed to pull something old into Ethan's memory. His eyes drifted toward the dark windows as if he could still see another storm far away from this one. "Northern Saskatchewan," he said softly. January. -32. Whiteout conditions so bad we could barely see 5 meters ahead. Nobody interrupted him now. Even the rookies stayed silent. The BCU team was running a recovery operation after an avalanche cut off a mining road near Lake Atherton. Vargo belonged to Sergeant Nolan Reeves back then. Ethan paused briefly. The Doberman's ears twitched at the name. Nolan was the only handler that dog ever fully bonded with. Commander Morin folded her arms slowly. "What happened?" Ethan stared at the frost gathering along the edges of the window glass. "The mountain moved before we could get everyone out." The room became still enough to hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Vargo lifted his head slowly into Ethan's hand the moment the man fell quiet. Not demanding comfort. Offering it. One of the young officers near the doorway swallowed hard at the sight. Because for the first time since arriving at the unit, the Doberman no longer looked like a broken police dog. He looked like something far sadder. A soul that had simply been waiting for the sound of someone who survived the same storm. Morning arrived slowly over the NPD K9 compound, pale winter light filtering through thick clouds that still hung low across the Alberta sky. The storm had passed during the night, but the cold remained sharp enough to sting exposed skin within seconds. Frost glazed the parked cruisers in silver, and thin ribbons of steam curled from the rooftop vents of the administration building into the motionless dawn. Most of the officers arrived carrying paper cups of coffee and the heavy silence that followed difficult weather. Yet the mood inside the unit felt different now. Quieter. More watchful. Because word had already spread through the compound before sunrise. Vargo had obeyed someone. Officer Dean Wallace stood alone near the indoor training arena, staring through the observation glass while workers cleared snow from the outer lot with tractors. Inside the arena, Vargo sat calmly near Ethan Mercer beside a row of padded barriers and scent detection crates. No leash. No tension. The Doberman simply watched the man move through the room with patient focus, like a compass finally finding north again. Dean shook his head slowly. "I spent 7 months trying to build trust with that dog," he muttered. Commander Elise Morin folded her arms beside him. "And maybe the dog spent 7 months waiting for someone else." Inside the arena, Ethan crouched near a steel equipment case while Vargo remained seated beside him without command. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly against the cold concrete walls. Somewhere farther down the hall, officers laughed faintly during shift change, but the Doberman never looked away from Ethan's hands. Every movement mattered to him. Every sound. Ethan picked up an old rubber training baton from the floor and placed it across the room nearly 15 meters away. "Search," he said quietly. Vargo did not move. Several younger handlers watching from the doorway exchanged confused glances. Then Ethan gave the same short whistle from the night before. Instantly the Doberman rose and crossed the room with smooth precision, locating the baton within seconds before returning directly to Ethan's side. No hesitation. No distraction. One of the rookies whispered under his breath. "That is impossible." Ethan clipped the baton back onto the case and scratched gently beneath Vargo's collar. "No," he said softly without looking up. "He is listening now." Commander Morin stepped into the arena, boots echoing against the concrete floor. "Then explain something to me," she said carefully. "Why does the whistle matter?" Ethan's expression shifted slightly at the question. Not discomfort exactly. More like someone reopening a door he had spent years trying to keep shut. Vargo leaned lightly against his leg as if sensing the change in him. Ethan stared across the arena for several moments before answering. Because during northern extraction work, voice commands failed in blizzards. His tone remained calm, but distant now. Wind swallowed everything. Radios froze. Visibility disappeared. So handlers used signal whistles instead. Different tones meant different instructions. Dean frowned slightly. "And Vargo only responds to yours?" Ethan nodded once. "Not mine originally." Silence settled across the arena again. Beyond the high windows, snow drifted slowly off the pine branches lining the perimeter fence. Ethan rubbed his hands together briefly against the cold before continuing. "Sergeant Nolan Reeves trained Vargo from the time he was a pup. That whistle pattern belonged to Nolan." He paused there. Just long enough for grief to slip quietly into the room beside them. The night of the avalanche, communications collapsed completely. "We lost visual contact with half the team." One of the younger officers swallowed hard. Nobody interrupted him now. Nolan kept blowing the recall whistle through the storm so Vargo could track the survivors back toward extraction points. Ethan's eyes lowered toward the Doberman beside him. It was the last thing the dog heard before the mountain came down. The room fell completely still. Even the rookie officers stopped shifting their weight. Vargo sat quietly beside Ethan with his amber eyes fixed upward, listening to the voice the same way some people listen to prayer. Then Ethan reached slowly into his coat pocket and removed a small metal whistle hanging from a worn black cord. The silver surface was scratched dull from years of use. Vargo saw it immediately. The Doberman's ears lifted. His breathing deepened once. And for the first time since arriving at the unit, his tail moved softly against the concrete floor. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm across the NPD K9 compound. Snowstorms came and went over northern Alberta, coating the highways in gray slush and turning the early morning silver beneath weak winter sunlight. But inside the training division, conversations had changed. Officers who once mocked Vargo now stopped to watch him through the observation windows whenever Ethan Mercer entered the arena. Nobody said the Doberman was cured. Nobody used words like miracle. Police officers learned long ago not to trust dramatic explanations. Still, something undeniable had shifted. Vargo no longer wandered through drills with distant eyes. He listened now. Not to shouted commands or snapping leashes, but to the quiet sound of a metal whistle hanging against Ethan's coat. One Thursday morning, before sunrise fully reached the compound, Commander Elise Morin ordered a full tactical evaluation inside the indoor training course. The air smelled faintly of rubber flooring, machine oil, and melting snow carried in on heavy boots. A fresh obstacle maze had been assembled overnight using scent crates, narrow corridors, suspended barriers, and hidden tracking objects designed to simulate a missing person search during extreme winter conditions. Dean Wallace stood near the entrance holding his clipboard tightly enough for the pages to bend beneath his gloves. If he fails this one, he murmured to Morin, the board will retire him permanently. Morin nodded once. Then let us see who the dog really is. Officers gathered quietly along the outer railings while the overhead lights hummed against the steel rafters above. Vargo waited beside Ethan near the starting gate. Calm. Silent. Watching. The Doberman's black and tan coat gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, muscles relaxed but alert beneath his frame. Ethan crouched slowly in front of him and adjusted the old leather collar gently with one hand. You do not have to prove anything today, he whispered softly. Just breathe. Vargo stared into his eyes without blinking. Then Commander Morin raised her hand. Begin evaluation. Dean gave the first command sharply. Search. Vargo did not move. Murmurs spread quietly through the watching officers. One rookie sighed under his breath as if expecting disappointment all over again. Ethan remained kneeling beside the Doberman for another second. Then he stood. No shouting. No leash correction. Only a single whistle drifting softly across the arena. Thin. Familiar. The effect was immediate. Vargo rose and moved forward like something waking from deep water. Smooth. Controlled. Focused. The Doberman entered the maze without hesitation, weaving through the barriers with silent precision while the room slowly fell quiet around him. He ignored distractions. Ignored recorded noise simulations playing through hidden speakers. Ignored the scent traps designed to confuse. Tracking dogs during stress drills. Every movement carried purpose now. Ethan stepped aside near the wall, saying nothing further. Because Vargo no longer needed commands every few seconds. He only needed trust. Dean stared at the monitors in disbelief while the Doberman cleared the suspended bridge obstacle in less than 30 seconds before locating the hidden scent pouch beneath a collapsed panel near the rear corridor. One of the handlers whispered quietly, he has never completed that section before. But the hardest part still waited ahead. At the center of the course stood a narrow steel tunnel built to simulate confined avalanche debris. Vargo froze the moment he reached the entrance. The entire arena seemed to stop breathing with him. The Doberman lowered his head slightly, ears twitching as memories moved somewhere behind his eyes. Snow. Wind. Darkness. Buried voices swallowed by a mountain. Ethan saw it immediately. The fear was back. Not aggression. Not confusion. Grief. Quiet and deep. Dean took a step forward. He is shutting down again. But Ethan lifted one hand gently without looking away from the tunnel. No, he said softly. He is remembering. The Doberman remained still for 3 long seconds. Then Ethan raised the whistle once more and played the same short pattern Nolan Reeves had used years earlier in the storm near Lake Atherton. Vargo closed his eyes briefly at the sound. And when they opened again, the fear was gone. The Doberman walked forward into the darkness of the tunnel alone while every officer in the arena stood frozen in silence watching a broken soul choose trust one more time. The steel tunnel swallowed sound differently than the rest of the arena. Inside it, every breath echoed softly against cold metal walls lined with packed foam and artificial debris meant to simulate collapsed snow structures. The overhead lights flickered faintly through narrow gaps, casting pale bands across the darkness where Vargo moved alone. Outside the tunnel, nobody spoke. Not the rookies. Not Dean Wallace. Not even Commander Elise Morin. They only listened to the faint scrape of claws against metal somewhere inside the confined passage. Ethan Mercer stood motionless near the entrance, one hand wrapped around the old whistle hanging from its black cord. His eyes never left the darkness ahead. Because he knew what the others did not. This drill was never about obedience. It was about memory. Vargo disappeared. Deeper into the tunnel for several long seconds before a soft bark finally echoed back through the structure. Not sharp. Not aggressive. A signal. Dean looked down at his clipboard automatically before realizing his hands were shaking slightly from the tension in the room. He found the target, one of the handlers whispered quietly. Then the Doberman emerged from the opposite end carrying the hidden scent marker gently in his mouth. Calm. Focused. Whole. The arena erupted into stunned silence instead of applause. Somehow clapping would have felt disrespectful. Like cheering inside a church. Ethan knelt as Vargo approached him. The Doberman placed the marker into his hand before lowering his head against Ethan's shoulder. For a moment, the hardened tactical officer closed his eyes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while snow tapped softly against the high windows. And something inside that room finally loosened after years of holding its breath. Commander Morin stepped forward slowly. Full marks, she said quietly. Highest stress response recovery we have recorded this year. Dean exhaled hard through his nose and shook his head with disbelief. I thought he was damaged beyond service. Ethan rubbed gently behind Vargo's ears. So did I. Those words lingered heavily in the arena. Because nobody was entirely sure whether he meant the dog or himself. Later that afternoon, while twilight settled pale blue across the snow-covered compound, Ethan sat alone in the staff break room with a mug of black coffee cooling untouched between his hands. The old radiator hissed softly beneath the windows while wind moved through the pine trees outside in long mournful breaths. Vargo rested near the doorway instead of the kennel assigned to him. Every few minutes the Doberman lifted his head just enough to confirm Ethan remained there. Then he would settle again. Officer Dean Wallace entered quietly carrying a thin file folder beneath one arm. Mind if I sit? Ethan nodded once. Dean lowered himself carefully into the chair across from him. The younger officer looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone realizing he had misunderstood something important for a very long time. He slid the folder across the table. I requested the archived BCU records this morning. Ethan's expression tightened almost immediately. Dean opened the folder slowly beneath the yellow light overhead. Inside were old operation reports, weather maps, and grainy recovery photographs from the Lake Atherton avalanche nearly 4 years earlier. Most pages carried heavy black redactions across names and coordinates. But one photograph remained uncovered. Ethan stared at it silently. A younger version of himself stood knee-deep in snow beside Sergeant Nolan Reeves near a rescue helicopter. Between them sat a younger Vargo wearing an orange cold-weather harness dusted white with ice. Nolan's arm rested proudly across the Doberman's shoulders. Dean studied the photograph carefully. You were not just there that night, he said quietly. Ethan looked away toward the darkening windows. No, Dean hesitated before asking the question everyone else had avoided. Then why did you leave? For several seconds only the radiator answered with its tired metallic hiss. Vargo rose slowly from the doorway and crossed the room without sound until his head rested gently against Ethan's knee. The older officer stared down at the Doberman for a long moment before speaking. Because when the mountain came down, he said softly, I was the one who told Nolan to go back inside. Silence filled the room completely after that. Outside, snow began falling again over the Alberta highway beyond the compound, soft and endless beneath the coming night. The snow returned heavier after midnight, drifting across the northern highways in long white curtains that swallowed headlights and road signs whole. Alberta winters had a way of making the world feel smaller after dark. Quieter. More fragile. Inside the NPD K9 compound, most of the lights had already dimmed for the evening shift when the emergency radio shattered the silence across the operations desk. Dispatch to all available units. Officer down near Blackstone Ridge Access Road. Possible vehicle rollover. Severe weather conditions interfering with drone support. The room changed instantly. Chairs scraped across tile floors. Radios crackled alive. Coffee cups were abandoned half full beside open reports. Commander Elise Morin grabbed the nearest microphone while snow hammered softly against the station windows. Location confirmation. Static hissed through the speaker before dispatch answered. Last signal ping approximately 42 kilometers north of Highway 17. Officer Liam Corbett missing after responding to stranded motorists. Visibility near zero. Dean Wallace swore quietly under his breath. Everyone in northern operations knew Blackstone Ridge. Narrow roads. Dense pine forest. Steep frozen embankments. During storms, even snowplows avoided certain sections after midnight. Morin turned sharply toward the equipment lockers. Prepare thermal units and extraction gear. Then she stopped. Because across the room, Ethan Mercer had already risen to his feet. Vargo stood beside him before a single command was spoken. The Doberman's posture had changed again. Focused. Listening. Ethan reached slowly for his winter coat hanging near the wall while the old whistle rested against his chest beneath the fabric. The drones will not see anything in this storm, he said quietly. The dog will. Morin hesitated. Officially, Vargo still remained under evaluation status. Officially, Ethan Mercer was no longer active tactical personnel. But outside the station windows, the wind screamed hard enough to rattle the glass. Somewhere beyond that storm, a young officer was alone in the dark. Sometimes paperwork mattered less than time. Morin nodded once. Take Unit 4. Snow exploded sideways across the parking lot as the emergency trucks rolled out of the compound 20 minutes later. The highway beyond Edmonton had nearly vanished beneath fresh accumulation, forcing the convoy to crawl carefully through blowing white darkness. Red and blue lights flashed uselessly against the storm, swallowed within meters by drifting snow. Inside Unit 4, the heater hummed weakly while Ethan drove with both hands locked steady on the wheel. Vargo sat upright in the passenger seat instead of the rear kennel, eyes fixed ahead through the windshield as if searching for something invisible within the storm itself. Dean's voice crackled over the radio from the lead vehicle. Road conditions worsening near kilometer marker 83. Ethan glanced briefly toward Vargo. The Doberman had not blinked in several minutes. He smells something already, Ethan murmured quietly. Nearly an hour later, the convoy reached the last accessible section of Blackstone Ridge before the snow became too deep for the vehicles to continue safely. Wind tore through the pine trees with a low haunting sound like distant ocean waves. Officers climbed out into knee-deep snow while visibility dropped to less than 10 meters. Searchlights swept uselessly through the whiteout. Thermal drones are blind, one of the tech officers called over the wind. Too much ice in the air. Morin looked toward Ethan. Can he track in this? Ethan lowered himself beside Vargo near the edge of the road. Snow gathered across the Doberman's shoulders almost immediately. The old whistle rested cold against Ethan's glove. For one quiet moment, man and dog simply looked at each other while the storm howled around them. Not handler and animal. Survivors. Ethan leaned close enough for his forehead to touch Vargo's briefly. One last time, he whispered. Then the whistle sounded softly through the storm. Thin. Familiar. The Doberman's ears lifted instantly. Vargo stepped forward into the blizzard without hesitation, nose low against the wind, black shape disappearing meter by meter into the endless white forest beyond the road. Ethan followed close behind with a tether line secured to his harness while the rest of the team watched in silence. Because deep down, every officer standing there understood something difficult and beautiful at the same time. Some souls are not healed by forgetting the storm. They are healed by walking back into it together. The forest beyond Blackstone Ridge felt endless beneath the storm. Snow lashed sideways through the towering pines, erasing tracks almost the moment they formed, while the wind carried that deep hollow sound only northern winters could make. Ethan Mercer pushed forward through knee-deep drifts behind Vargo, the tether line stretched tight between them as the Doberman cut silently through the white darkness ahead. Ice gathered along Ethan's beard and collar within minutes. His lungs burned from the cold air. But Vargo never slowed. The dog moved with a certainty that no machine in the convoy could match. Behind them, the distant searchlights from the rescue teams faded until only pale flickers remained between the trees. Radio signals crackled weakly through static. Nature had swallowed almost everything else. Visibility is collapsing, Commander Elise Morin warned through the earpiece. If conditions worsen, we pull you both back. Ethan pressed the transmit button once against his coat. Understood. But neither he nor Vargo stopped moving. The Doberman suddenly veered sharply downhill through a narrow break in the trees where snow had drifted nearly waist-high against buried rocks and frozen brush. Ethan stumbled once, catching himself against a pine trunk while the tether jerked forward hard. Then he heard it. Faint. Almost lost beneath the storm. A voice. Weak. Human. Vargo barked sharply ahead for the first time all night. Ethan pushed harder through the drifts until the slope opened into a shallow ravine partially hidden beneath fallen snow. There, nearly buried beside the twisted frame of an overturned patrol vehicle, lay Officer Liam Corbett. The young officer was conscious but fading fast from exposure, one arm trapped awkwardly beneath packed snow and shattered ice near the driver's side door. Frost coated his jacket and eyelashes. His lips trembled blue. From the cold. "Oh, thank God," Liam whispered hoarsely the moment he saw movement through the storm. Vargo reached him first. The Doberman immediately pressed his body close against the young officer's chest, offering warmth the way rescue dogs sometimes did instinctively during prolonged winter searches. Liam weakly buried trembling fingers into the thick fur along Vargo's neck. Ethan dropped beside them in the snow, breath steaming hard through the freezing air while he radioed the coordinates back to the convoy. "We found him," Ethan said, voice rough with relief. Static crackled loudly before Morin answered. "Stay where you are. Extraction teams are moving in now." Ethan nodded even though nobody could see him. He carefully worked to free Liam's trapped arm while the storm screamed through the ravine overhead. The overturned cruiser shifted slightly beneath the weight of accumulating snow, groaning softly against the frozen embankment. Vargo suddenly stiffened beside them. His ears lifted sharply toward the ridge above. Ethan saw it immediately. The same look from years ago. The same warning before disaster moved. Then came the sound. A deep crack somewhere high above the ravine. Not loud. Worse than loud. Heavy. Final. Ethan's blood turned cold instantly. "Move," he whispered. The snow shelf above them gave way seconds later, collapsing downward in a violent rush of ice and powder. Ethan lunged forward, dragging Liam clear as the first wave slammed across the ravine floor. Snow exploded around them in blinding white force. Vargo disappeared completely beneath the collapse. "Vargo!" Ethan shouted into the storm. Panic tore through his voice before he could stop it. For several terrible seconds there was nothing except wind and moving snow. Then a dark shape burst upward through the drift near Ethan's side. The Doberman emerged coughing hard, snow coating his face and shoulders, but alive. Ethan grabbed him immediately with both hands, pulling the dog close against his chest while relief hit him so suddenly it almost hurt. Vargo trembled once beneath the cold before pressing his head against Ethan's neck. Not fear. Trust. Behind them, rescue lights finally appeared through the storm as the extraction teams descended into the ravine. Liam looked weakly toward the Doberman through half-frozen lashes. "That dog saved me," he whispered. Ethan looked down at Vargo for a long moment while snow continued falling softly around them. Then he rested his forehead gently against the Doberman's. "No," he said quietly. "He saved both of us." Spring arrived quietly over northern Alberta. Not all at once. Just small mercies at first. Snowbanks shrinking along the roadsides. Meltwater running beneath sheets of old ice. Pine branches finally releasing the weight of winter one soft gust at a time. At the Doberman K9 compound outside Edmonton, the mornings no longer felt quite so heavy. The floodlights that once glowed against endless storms now clicked off earlier beneath pale gold sunrises, and the training yard carried the scent of thawing earth instead of frozen steel. Officer Liam Corbett recovered fully after the rescue at Blackstone Ridge. He returned to duty 6 weeks later with a slight stiffness in his left shoulder and a new habit of stopping by the K9 unit before every shift. Sometimes he brought coffee for the handlers. Sometimes he simply stood quietly near the fence watching Vargo train beneath the morning light. The young officer never spoke much about the night of the storm. Most people who survive something like that do not. But every time the Doberman passed him in the yard, Liam's expression softened with the kind of gratitude words rarely carry properly. Vargo changed too. Not dramatically. Healing rarely looks dramatic in real life. It looked more like this, the Doberman sleeping peacefully through the night instead of pacing his kennel during snowstorms. It looked like responding to younger handlers without panic in his eyes. It looked like resting near windows when freight trains passed instead of trembling at the sound. Small things. Holy things. Ethan Mercer remained at the compound longer than anyone expected. Officially, Commander Elise Moore enlisted him as a civilian consultant assisting with advanced cold-weather K9 conditioning. Unofficially, everyone understood the truth. Some wounds only heal when someone stays long enough to face them. One quiet April morning, a new class of rookie handlers assembled inside the outdoor training yard while wet snow dripped steadily from the fence rails beneath clear blue sky. The younger officers stood in a loose line holding leashes and clipboards, nervous energy visible in every stiff shoulder and restless glance. Vargo sat calmly near the obstacle course beside Ethan without a leash attached at all. The Doberman looked older now beneath the sunlight. A few strands of silver had begun appearing near his muzzle. But his eyes no longer carried that distant haunted look from the winter. They carried peace. One of the rookies, barely 23, raised his hand carefully toward Ethan. "Sir," he asked, "how did you get him to trust again?" Ethan looked out across the training yard for several seconds before answering. Wind moved softly through the pine trees beyond the fence while somewhere down the highway a freight train horn echoed low across the thawing fields. Vargo lifted his ears immediately at the sound but remained relaxed beside him. Ethan rested one hand gently against the Doberman's neck. "I did not," he said quietly. The rookies exchanged confused looks. Ethan's eyes drifted toward the distant horizon where the last patches of snow still lingered beneath the trees. "Dogs remember things differently than we do," he continued softly. "People try to bury pain. Dogs carry it beside them until someone helps them feel safe enough to set it down." Silence settled over the yard after that. Even the younger officers seemed to understand they were listening to something bigger than training advice now. Ethan looked down at Vargo with the faintest smile touching the corner of his mouth. "He did not need commands," he said. "He needed someone willing to walk back into the storm with him." Vargo leaned lightly against Ethan's leg the way he always did now whenever the man grew quiet. Not because the Doberman feared being left behind anymore. Because loyalty had finally become something gentle instead of desperate. Commander Elise Morin watched from the station doorway with her coffee warming slowly between her hands. Beside her, Dean Wallace shook his head softly while watching the dog cross the yard with calm steady confidence. "Funny thing," Dean murmured. "We spent months trying to train obedience into him." Morin smiled faintly without looking away from the scene. "Turns out," she said quietly, "the dog already knew how to follow. He was just waiting for the right voice." A breeze moved across the compound then, carrying the scent of wet pine and thawing earth beneath the warm Canadian sun. Ethan reached into his coat pocket one final time and lifted the old silver whistle resting against its worn black cord. The metal caught the morning light briefly before he gave a soft single note into the air. Vargo turned immediately toward him. Not out of duty. Not out of fear. Only trust. And somewhere deep beneath the sound of melting snow and distant train tracks, two survivors finally understood the same quiet truth. Some souls do not need saving. They only need someone who refuses to leave when winter comes.